It was a long, lonely stretch of road in Montana. The kind of place where the only company you have is the sound of your tires on the asphalt, and the occasional flicker of distant lights from other trucks on the horizon. I had just finished a long haul, and after a few hours of driving, I felt my eyelids getting heavy. I decided to pull off at a small rest stop to get some rest before continuing. There was no one else there, just a single truck in the distance, parked under a dim light. I pulled up next to the empty space and parked. I didn't even bother to shut off the engine, just pulled the air brake, laid back, and closed my eyes. I set my alarm for an hour's nap. When I woke up, something was wrong. The air felt different, heavy, cold. I sat up and looked around. The truck I had parked next to earlier was now gone. But what really caught my attention was a figure standing in the distance, beside the road. He was tall, wearing a faded red trucker cap and a dark coat. His face was obscured, but I could feel his eyes on me. I thought I was just imagining things from lack of sleep, but there was something about him that felt real too real. I decided to get out and stretch, thinking the fresh air would clear my head. As soon as I opened the door, I heard the faint sound of an engine. Another truck was coming down the road, but this truck, it wasn't like the others. It was silent, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a ghost. I squinted, trying to get a better look. The truck was massive, its grills shining like the face of a beast. But when it got closer, it stopped just before passing my truck. I froze. The engine stopped too, and for a moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then, the driver's side door opened. I expected to see someone get out, but no one did. The door swung open by itself, and the truck's headlights flickered, casting strange shadows across the lot. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. Then I heard the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps, coming toward me. I turned around to look behind me, but the figure by the road, the one I had seen earlier, was gone. I was alone. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Just as I was about to run, I heard the voice. "You shouldn't have stayed." I spun around, but the truck was gone. The rest stop was empty again, as if nothing had happened. I didn't stay long enough to figure it out. I jumped in my truck and drove off as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I still drive through Montana now and then, but I always make sure I pass that rest stop in the middle of the night, because I know now that trucker is still out there. I've driven through every kind of weather, every kind of road condition, but nothing prepared me for what happened on that stretch of highway just before dawn. It was a typical late-night haul. I was coming up on a remote rest area I'd never stopped at before. There wasn't much around, just a few scattered lights in the distance and the low hum of the highway stretching on forever. I pulled into the lot and parked next to an old semi-truck, its engine off, the driver's seat empty. The air was thick, like the night was holding its breath. I needed a break, so I grabbed my jacket and headed to the diner attached to the rest stop. The door creaked as I entered. The diner was eerily silent, and I noticed the waitress standing behind the counter, her head down. Her long, dark hair covered her face. "Hey, you open?" I asked, walking to the counter. She didn't respond. I waited a moment, unsure if she was just tired or maybe didn't hear me. Then she slowly looked up. Her eyes were wide, vacant and blinking, almost unnatural. "I'll just have some coffee," I muttered, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. She nodded, but didn't say anything. I took a seat by the window and stared out at the empty parking lot. The truck I'd parked next to was now gone, though I could have sworn it was just there. I checked the clock. It was almost 4 a.m. The minutes dragged on, and the coffee she had set in front of me grew cold. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, like someone was watching me. Then, the waitress returned, this time standing much closer to me than I had realized. "It's almost time." I stared at her, confused. She leaned closer, her breath cold against my cheek. They always come at dawn. That's when I felt it's a presence, something shifting in the air behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. I looked back at the waitress, but she was now gone. The diner was empty, completely empty. No sign of life. The silence was suffocating. I grabbed my coffee and ran outside, only to see the truck I'd parked next to back again. But this time, it was facing me. Its headlights were on, and the engine was running. The figure inside the truck was motionless, its head hanging low. I couldn't bring myself to approach. My instincts screamed at me to get out. I jumped in my truck, locked the doors, and sped off. But as I looked in the mirror, I saw the truck behind me still following. The headlights stayed close, never wavering, and I could see a dark figure in the driver's seat, staring at me. I drove 4 miles, heart pounding, until I couldn't see the truck anymore. I pulled over at a safe spot, completely out of breath. It's been days since that night, but every time I close my eyes, I still see the eyes of the figure in that truck, and I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting for the next driver who stops at the last rest stop before dawn. I've been driving this route for years, and I thought I'd seen it all. From the late-night fog to the weird calls over the CB, nothing fazed me anymore. But that was before I picked up a strange transmission one night. It was around 1:30 a.m. when I was cruising along I-40, the road stretching out endlessly before me. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and I was the only truck on that stretch of highway. The only sounds were the low hum of my rig and the occasional crackle of my CB radio. Then, it happened. The static on the radio changed. It wasn't the usual interference. It was as if someone was trying to speak. At first, I thought it was just another prankster on the line. But then the voice came through clear and unmistakable. Turn back. It's not safe. I froze. I didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't one of the regulars. Who is this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The voice didn't respond immediately. The static buzzed for a few seconds, then came again. Turn back. You're getting too close. I looked out the windshield. Nothing but darkness. No other headlights. No signs. Just endless highway. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a glitch in the system or a bad signal from some station. But something in me told me to listen. I grabbed the mic and responded. Who's out there? The voice came back, more urgent this time. You're close. Too close. Turn around. It's already too late. At this point, my heart was racing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced at the GPS. Nothing unusual. The route was clear, but the voice kept repeating, over and over again. Turn back. I slammed my fist on the radio, cutting off the transmission. But just as I did, a loud bang came from the rear of the truck. It sounded like something or someone had hit the back of my trailer. I jerked the wheel to the side, swerving into the emergency lane. My hands shook as I reached for the radio again. Is anyone there? I asked frantically. The radio crackled once more, and the voice returned, now soft and resigned. It's too late now. You should have listened. I was already too far out of town, but I couldn't go back. The truck felt heavier, like something was pushing against it, urging me forward. I didn't stop again until dawn, when I finally parked at a rest area. The truck was still idling, but when I got out to inspect it, there was nothing on the back of the trailer. No damage, no sign of anyone having touched it. I've never heard that voice again, but every time I drive that stretch of highway, I feel like something's still following me, and every now and then, I swear I hear that faint static again on the radio, but now, I don't listen. If you drive long enough, you start to feel safe in your truck. It becomes your second home, a steel fortress against the world. But one night, I learned that even inside my own cab, I wasn't alone. It was around 3 a.m., and I had pulled into a rest area just off a lonely highway in Nebraska. The place was dead quiet, just a couple of trucks parked under the dim, buzzing lights. I locked my doors, climbed into the sleeper, and lay down. The hum of distant highway noise lulled me into a light sleep. Then something woke me up, a rustling sound. I froze. It was coming from inside my truck. I held my breath, ears straining. Maybe I had left a window cracked. Maybe the wind had pushed a plastic bag. Then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate movement, like someone shifting their weight. I reached under my pillow for the tire iron I kept there. My fingers curled around the cold metal. I sat up, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and then I saw him. A man, sitting in the driver's seat. His back was to me, shoulders slightly hunched, like he had been there for hours. I hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt the truck shift under his weight. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned his head, but not like a normal person. His neck twisted too far, vertebrae popping as his face came into view, and he was grinning. "You left the door unlocked." My stomach lurched. I didn't. I knew I didn't. Then, he lunged. I swung the tire iron with everything I had, but he was gone, just disappeared. I scrambled into the driver's seat, heart pounding, locked the doors twice, then peeled out of that rest stop like the devil himself was chasing me. I didn't stop driving until sunrise. When I finally dared to check my cab in daylight, I found something on the seat where he had been sitting, a single, dirty handprint. Truck stops are supposed to be safe havens, bright lights, warm coffee, a place to rest. But after what I saw at Miller's Gas and Diner, I don't stop at just any truck stop anymore. It was a little past 2 a.m. when I pulled in. The place was small, just a handful of pumps and a diner with a flickering neon sign. Miller's. I'd never seen it before, and I knew this route well. Something about it felt off, but exhaustion makes you desperate. I parked, stretched, and headed inside. The diner was empty. No customers, no employees, just the low hum of an old jukebox playing a song I didn't recognize. Then I saw her, a waitress, standing behind the counter, her back to me. She wore an old-fashioned uniform light blue dress, white apron-like, something out of the 50s. Her blonde hair was perfectly curled, but she stood too still. Hey, I said. "Are you guys still serving?" She didn't answer. Didn't turn around. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Then I saw the clock on the wall. It wasn't moving. The hands were stuck at 2:17 a.m. Something was wrong. I took a step back toward the door. That's when the jukebox skipped. The same eerie note played over and over, stuck in a broken loop. And the waitress, she turned her head too far, her neck twisting at an impossible angle. Her eyes met mine, wide and unblinking. Her mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. "You're not supposed to be here." The lights flickered off. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my truck. Door slammed shut, engine roaring to life. As I sped off, I glanced in the mirror. The truck stop was gone, just an empty stretch of road behind me. I checked later, asked other drivers, even looked up old maps. There was never a Miller's Gas and Diner. Not there, not anywhere. But every now and then, when I drive that stretch of road at night, I swear I see the glow of an old neon sign flickering in the distance, and I keep driving. I don't pick up hitchhikers, not because I don't want to help people, but because I've heard too many horror stories from other truckers. But that night was different. It was just past midnight, on a stretch of highway in Montana. The road was empty. Nothing but the occasional flicker of my headlights reflecting off road signs. Then I saw him, a man standing on the side of the road, thumb out. He was wearing a faded denim jacket and jeans, like he'd been walking for miles. His head was lowered, face hidden beneath the brim of a baseball cap. I should have kept driving. I wanted to keep driving, but the moment I passed him, my CB radio crackled to life. A voice: "You should have stopped, James." My blood ran cold. Nobody had called me by my first name. Not on the radio, not in years. I glanced in the side mirror. The hitchhiker was still there, but he was facing me now. And even from a distance, I knew. He was smiling. I hit the gas, heart slamming against my ribs. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the wheel. This had to be some kind of joke, right? Maybe another trucker messing with me. But then the radio crackled again. "You should have stopped. You know me." I reached for the dial, twisting it off. Silence. For the next 10 miles, I kept my eyes on the road. My brain raced, trying to make sense of what just happened. That's when I saw something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the highway. Same denim jacket, same baseball cap. I slammed the brakes, my tires screeching against the asphalt. The truck lurched to a stop, just feet from the man. He slowly lifted his head, and that's when I saw his face. It was me, every detail. The scar above my eyebrow, the lines on my forehead, the same haunted eyes staring back at me. The CB radio crackled one last time. I just wanted a ride. Then he was gone, just vanished. I sat there for what felt like hours before I finally pulled myself together and drove away. I didn't stop until sunrise. I don't know who or what I saw that night, but I never ignored a hitchhiker again. I never stopped for one, either. I've spent most of my life on the road, and I know every major rest stop along my usual routes. But one night, I pulled into a place that shouldn't have existed. It was past 3 a.m., and exhaustion was hitting me hard. I needed a break, just a few minutes to stretch my legs and clear my head. That's when I saw the sign. Rest stop, -2. Malaysia didn't remember a stop in that area, but I wasn't going to question it. When you're that tired, you take what you can get. I pulled in, and immediately noticed something was off. The lot was mostly empty, except for 2 cars parked near the dimly lit building. No trucks, no signs of life. The building itself looked wrong, like it hadn't been maintained in years. The paint was peeling, the windows were clouded over, and the flickering neon sign above the door buzzed like a dying insect. But the real problem, the air, it felt heavy, thick, like stepping into a room where someone had just been talking about you. I should have left, but instead, I walked inside. The moment I stepped through the door, every hair on my body stood on end. The place was silent, not the peaceful kind, more like the kind that made your ears ring because something was missing. The lights inside buzzed, casting a sickly yellow glow over cracked tile floors. A few vending machines lined the wall, their glass fronts grimy with age. Then I saw the man. He sat in the corner, staring at the floor. His clothes were old-fashioned, something out of the 70s. Greasy hair, a tattered flannel. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. I cleared my throat. "Hey, you know how long this place has been here?" No response. I took a step forward. That's when I noticed the other customers. A woman by the bathroom door, standing too still. A teenage boy near the vending machines, his back turned to me. And an old man in a trucker hat, sitting at a table, mouth open, not breathing. None of them moved, not blinking, not breathing, just there. I felt a wave of nausea crawl up my spine. Something was wrong. I turned to leave, but then I heard a whisper. I spun around. The man in the corner was looking at me now. His lips barely moved as he whispered again, "You shouldn't be here." I bolted. I ran out, jumped into my truck, and floored it out of that parking lot. My heart was pounding, so hard I could barely see straight. 5 miles down the road, I started to calm down. I pulled out my GPS to double-check my route. No rest stop, Not on the map. Not in my memory. I checked the next morning, asked a few other truckers if they'd ever seen it. Every single one of them said the same thing. There's no rest stop on that stretch of road. So what the hell did I stop at? I've been driving long-haul routes for over a decade, and I've seen my share of weird things on the road. But nothing haunted me like what I saw on Interstate 17. It was a foggy night in Arizona. The kind where the mist clings to the pavement, like a living thing. Visibility was terrible, and I had to slow down just to make sure I didn't drift off the road. That's when I saw him, a man lying in the ditch on the right side of the road. I barely caught a glimpse of him through the fog, but his body was twisted at an unnatural angle, like he'd been hit by a car and left for dead. I pulled over. I knew I shouldn't have. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't just drive away. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the ditch. The silence was unsettling. No crickets, no wind, just the distant hum of my idling engine. I shined the light down. The ditch was empty. No man, no body, just damp grass and dirt. A cold chill ran down my spine. I knew I had seen him. Maybe he had crawled away. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. I turned back toward my truck and froze. There, standing beside my truck, was the man. His limbs were still twisted at those horrible angles, his head lolling to one side, his mouth slightly open as if he was trying to speak, but his eyes were locked onto mine. I stumbled backward, my heart slamming against my ribs. He took a step toward me, moving like a marionette with its strings cut. I didn't think, I ran. I jumped into the cab, slammed the door shut, and floored the gas. My truck roared to life, tires screeching as I sped off. I didn't look back. I didn't check my mirrors. I just drove. It wasn't until I reached a well-lit gas station 20 miles down the road that I finally allowed myself to breathe. I stepped out, my hand still shaking, and glanced at my side mirror. There, written in the condensation on the passenger side window, were 2 words: "Help me." I've been on the road long enough to see things most people wouldn't believe. But nothing prepared me for what happened on Route 89. It was just past 2 a.m., and I was hauling cargo through a desolate stretch of Utah highway. No lights, no signs of civilization, just miles of asphalt cutting through the darkness. My only company was the distant howl of the wind and the steady hum of my engine. Then, I saw it. A shape darted across the road, too fast for me to react. I slammed the brakes, my rig skidding slightly before coming to a stop. My heart pounded. I gripped the wheel, trying to steady my breathing. There was nothing in front of me, just empty road. Maybe I was seeing things. Long nights on the highway do that to you. I shook it off and kept driving. A few minutes later, I glanced at my side mirror. My stomach dropped. There was something in the back of my truck. It was just a shadow at first, barely visible in the dim glow of my taillights. But as I kept looking, the shape moved. It shifted, unfolding itself, like it was stretching. I turned on my interior trailer camera. Static. I felt sick. "Just keep driving," I muttered to myself. "Just keep driving." But then, the scratching started. Faint. At first, like nails dragging along the metal walls of the trailer. Then louder. More frantic. I tightened my grip on the wheel, trying to ignore it. Maybe an animal had gotten in. Yeah, that had to be it. Then, something hit the back door, hard. The whole truck shuddered from the impact. My breath came in short gasps. I reached for the CB radio, but my fingers were shaking too much to press the button. Another bang. Then another dot. Something dash no. Someone was trying to get out. I needed to stop. Get out. Check the cargo. But every instinct in my body screamed no. And then, the locks on the back door rattled, like they were being undone from the inside. I floored the gas. The truck roared as I sped down the empty road, the trailer swaying behind me. The banging got louder, more desperate. Whatever was back there wanted out. And then silence. The sudden absence of noise was almost worse than the banging. I didn't dare look in the mirrors. I just kept driving. I reached a truck stop an hour later, parked under the bright lights, and jumped out of the cab. My legs felt like jelly as I walked to the back of the trailer. The locks were still in place, untouched, but there was something else. Long, deep scratches covered the back doors, as if something had clawed at the metal, trying to tear its way out. I never checked the cargo manifest, never wanted to know what I was hauling that night. All I know is, whatever was back there, it wasn't meant to get out. I've been a trucker for over 15 years, and in all that time, I never picked up a hitchhiker until that night. It was past midnight, and I was driving through a lonely stretch of highway in Arizona. The desert stretched endlessly, on both sides, and the only light came from my high beams cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw him. A man stood by the side of the road, dressed in a faded brown coat and jeans, his thumb sticking out. Normally, I would have kept going, but something about him made me slow down. Maybe it was the way he stood motionless, almost too still. Or maybe it was the fact that there wasn't another soul for miles. I pulled over. He climbed in without a word, shutting the door behind him. His skin was pale, almost grayish under the dim cabin light, and his eyes were hidden under the shadow of his cap. "Where are you headed?" I asked. He finally spoke, his voice a low whisper. "North." Something about his tone sent a chill down my spine. I forced a chuckle. "Well, you're in luck. I'm headed that way." He didn't respond, just sat there, staring straight ahead. We drove in silence for a few miles, the hum of the engine the only sound between us. But then I noticed something odd. His reflection in the side mirror. It wasn't moving. I glanced at him. His chest rose and fell. His fingers tapped lightly on his knee. But in the mirror, he was still as stone. My stomach twisted. My hands tightened on the wheel. I tried to keep calm. "So, what's your name?" A pause. Then, "Nathan." I swallowed hard. "Been traveling long, Nathan." Again, silence. Then, in that same whispering tone, he muttered, "A long time." Something in the way he said it made my skin crawl. I decided to keep driving and ignore the gnawing unease in my gut. Then he started humming. It was soft at first, almost like a lullaby. But as the sound filled the cabin, something changed. The temperature dropped. My breath fogged up in front of me, and then the humming turned into a whisper. I couldn't understand the words, but I knew they weren't meant for me. My heart pounded. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" I forced a laugh, trying to shake the tension. He turned his head slowly, and for the first time, I saw his face fully. His eyes dark, empty pits. No irises, no pupils, just void. I slammed the brakes. The truck skidded, tires screeching. My hands were shaking as I turned to him, but he was gone. The passenger seat was empty. The door hadn't opened. The seatbelt was still buckled. And then, in the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the middle of the road, watching me. I floored the gas, speeding away, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the next truck stop. Later, I asked some of the older truckers if they'd ever seen anything like it. One of them, an old-timer named Gus, just shook his head. "You met him, huh?" he muttered, sipping his coffee. "Met who?" I asked, my throat dry. "The midnight hitchhiker," he said. "Been haunting these roads for decades. No one knows who he really is. Just that if you pick him up, he never really leaves." I never picked up another hitchhiker again. The treehouse had always been a place where I could escape. Growing up, it was my sanctuary, a secret hideaway where I could think and dream without anyone disturbing me. But after that night, it became something else entirely. It started innocently enough. My friend Jacob and I decided to camp out in the treehouse one Friday night, something we had done countless times before. We packed sleeping bags, flashlights, and snacks, eager for a night of stories and fun. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods around us grew silent. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent. It felt unnatural, almost oppressive. But we shrugged it off, deciding to start telling ghost stories to pass the time. Around midnight, the air grew colder, and a strange stillness settled over us. It was then that I noticed something odd. Through the small window of the treehouse, I could see the shadows in the woods, shifting, moving, though there was no breeze to explain it. Jacob noticed it too, his face scrunching in confusion. "What's that?" he asked, pointing into the trees. I peered into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. But then, I saw them ease, hundreds of them, scattered among the branches and leaves. They were watching us, their gleaming, reflective surfaces glowing in the moonlight. "Jacob, do you see that?" I whispered, my heart racing. Jacob turned pale, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, I see them." We were both frozen in place, staring at the countless pairs of eyes, watching us from the trees. They blinked slowly, as if studying us, and then, one by one, they started to move. The eyes moved as if they were coming closer to the treehouse, their movements jerky and unnatural. My blood ran cold as I realized they weren't just staring from the trees, they were climbing toward us. "Get down now," I yelled, grabbing Jacob's arm. We scrambled toward the ladder, but the moment my foot hit the first rung, something grabbed my ankle. I looked down, and in the dim light, I saw a figure, a pale, gaunt creature, climbing up the side of the tree. Its hands were long and spindly, its eyes large and unblinking. I couldn't breathe, unable to move as it crawled toward me. "Don't let it take me," I gasped. Jacob tried to pull me up, but the creature's grip was strong, and I felt my body being dragged down toward the ground. In a panic, I kicked it, desperate to free myself. The thing hissed, releasing me long enough for Jacob and me to scramble back into the treehouse. We slammed the wooden door shut, and for a moment, we were safe. But the eyes, they were still. They're blinking and moving in the trees. We could hear them now, scraping against the wood, as if trying to climb up to us. We didn't dare sleep that night. We stayed awake, clutching our flashlights and listening to the sound of those eyes. Inching closer by morning, when the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the eyes were gone. The woods were silent again, and the air felt normal. But I knew better. Something had followed us back. Something that only comes out when the night falls. We never went back to that treehouse again. And to this day, I still feel the gaze of those eyes following me wherever I go. We'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in town did. The treehouse was cursed. It had been built by an old man named Joseph, who disappeared mysteriously years ago. They said he'd been obsessed with the tree, claiming it was alive, that it had a mind of its own. When my friends and I decided to explore it, we thought it was just a myth. We thought the old man was just a crazy recluse. So, one Saturday afternoon, we set out to find the treehouse, laughing off the warnings we'd heard from others. The treehouse was located at the edge of town, deep in a forgotten part of the woods. The air around it felt different, colder, like we had crossed into a place that didn't belong to the living. Still, we climbed the old wooden ladder, ignoring the creaks and groans that echoed with each step. Inside the treehouse, there was nothing unusual at first glance. Dusty furniture covered in cobwebs, a few old books scattered across the floor, and an odd smell in the air like mildew mixed with something, sharper. But the longer we stayed, the more uncomfortable we became. That's when I felt it. It started as a faint vibration in the wood beneath my feet. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the sensation grew stronger. The floor trembled, as if the treehouse was breathing, inhaling and exhaling with a slow, steady rhythm. "I don't like this," my friend Mark said, his voice shaky. "Let's just leave," I suggested, but as we made our way to the ladder, something stopped us. The treehouse seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching across the room like something alive. We looked up at the windows, and that's when we saw a figure standing just outside. It was a man, his face hidden in shadow, but his presence was overwhelming. He was watching us, unmoving. I froze. "Who is that?" Mark whispered. Before I could answer, the air shifted. The temperature dropped, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The whispering started. At first, it was barely audible, like the wind, but then it grew clearer. "Get out. Leave now, or he'll take you." The voice echoed in our minds, not from any one place, but from every direction. We turned to see the figure was gone, but the whispers only grew louder. I could feel something cold wrap around my ankles, like invisible fingers gripping my legs, pulling me down. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I looked at Mark, and his face was pale, his eyes wide in terror. And then, the ladder, it disappeared. The treehouse was no longer in the same place. It had shifted. The ground below us was now a chasm, a black void stretching down into nothingness. We were trapped. The whispers turned into screams, filling my ears as the treehouse creaked and groaned, like it was alive and hungry. Without thinking, I grabbed Mark's arm and pulled him toward the walls, trying to find an escape. But every window we approached opened into the same black void, as if there was no outside world anymore, only the treehouse, its dark heart pulsing with the curse that had trapped us. I can't remember how we got out. All I know is that, when we finally left, the curse of the treehouse followed us. We can hear it even now, whispering, always whispering, and Joseph's warning still echoes in my mind. The tree is alive. It will take you, just like it took me. We'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in town did. The treehouse was cursed. It had been built by an old man named Joseph, who disappeared mysteriously years ago. They said he'd been obsessed with the tree, claiming it was alive, that it had a mind of its own. When my friends and I decided to explore it, we thought it was just a myth. We thought the old man was just a crazy recluse. So, one Saturday afternoon, we set out to find the treehouse, laughing off the warnings we'd heard from others. The treehouse was located at the edge of town, deep in a forgotten part of the woods. The air around it felt different, colder, like we had crossed into a place that didn't belong to the living. Still, we climbed the old wooden ladder, ignoring the creaks and groans that echoed with each step. Inside the treehouse, there was nothing unusual at first glance. Dusty furniture covered in cobwebs, a few old books scattered across the floor, and an odd smell in the air like mildew mixed with something ... sharper. But the longer we stayed, the more uncomfortable we became. That's when I felt it. It started as a faint vibration in the wood beneath my feet. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sensation grew stronger. The floor trembled, as if the treehouse was breathing, inhaling and exhaling with a slow, steady rhythm. "I don't like this," my friend Mark said, his voice shaky. "Let's just leave," I suggested. But as we made our way to the ladder, something stopped us. The treehouse seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching across the room like something alive. We looked up at the windows, and that's when we saw it. Figure standing just outside. It was a man, his face hidden in shadow, but his presence was overwhelming. He was watching us, unmoving. I froze. "Who is that?" Mark whispered. Before I could answer, the air shifted. The temperature dropped, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The whispering started. At first, it was barely audible, like the wind, but then it grew clearer. "Get out. Leave now, or he'll take you." The voice echoed in our minds, not from any one place, but from every direction. We turned to see the figure was gone, but the whispers only grew louder. I could feel something cold wrap around my ankles, like invisible fingers gripping my legs, pulling me down. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I looked at Mark, and his face was pale, his eyes wide in terror. And then, the ladder. It disappeared. The treehouse was no longer in the same place. It had shifted. The ground below us was now a chasm, a black void stretching down into nothingness. We were trapped. The whispers turned into screams, filling my ears as the treehouse creaked and groaned, like it was alive, live and hungry, without thinking. I grabbed Mark's arm and pulled him toward the walls, trying to find an escape. But every window we approached opened into the same black void, as if there was no outside world anymore, only the treehouse, its dark heart pulsing with the curse that had trapped us. I can't remember how we got out. All I know is that, when we finally left, the curse of the treehouse followed us. We can hear it even now, whispering, always whispering, and Joseph's warning still echoes in my mind. The tree is alive. It will take you, just like it took me. The old treehouse had always been a place of mystery. Everyone in our small town knew about it, but no one really talked about it. It was hidden deep within the woods, and though I had passed by it many times, I had never actually dared to go near it. That was, until last summer, my cousin Emily came to visit. And she had always been the adventurous type. Of course, she wanted to see the treehouse. After some convincing, I reluctantly agreed to go with her. We set off early one morning, the sun barely peeking through the trees, and made our way to the treehouse. It was even more eerie, up close. The large oak tree that supported it seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, its branches creaking as if it had been alive for centuries. The wooden ladder that led up to the treehouse was old and rotting, but we climbed it anyway, determined to explore. Once we reached the top, the atmosphere felt thick, heavy, with something unspoken. Inside, the air was stale, as if it had been undisturbed for years. But there was something about the place that felt alive, as if it was waiting for us. Emily started exploring the small space, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The wind outside picked up, rustling the leaves of the tree, but there was something strange about it. The rustling was almost like whispers, soft and unintelligible. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Emily froze, her expression shifting from curiosity to unease. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the whispers were growing louder. It was almost like the leaves themselves were speaking. Suddenly, a gust of wind slammed into the side of the treehouse, making the entire structure shake. I stumbled, grabbing onto the nearest post to steady myself. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice urgent. But Emily wasn't moving. She was staring at something near the window. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw it, a figure, standing beneath the tree. It was tall, shadowy, and had no clear features. Its shape was distorted, flickering in and out of focus, like a ghost trapped in the trees. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "Emily, we need to leave now," I pleaded, but she didn't respond. She was frozen, her eyes wide, staring at the figure below. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic now, filling the treehouse with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if they were calling to us, pulling us closer to something we couldn't see. Finally, Emily blinked and snapped out of it. She turned to me, her face pale. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't need to be told twice. We rushed to the ladder and scrambled down as quickly as we could. The figure below remained motionless, watching us, its presence suffocating. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of my house. But even now, weeks later, I can still hear the whispers when the wind blows through the trees. I don't know what we encountered in that treehouse, but I don't ever want to find out again. My friends and I stumbled upon the old treehouse. When we were exploring the woods behind our neighborhood, it had been abandoned for years, its wooden walls worn down by time and weather. There were no signs of life, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there in ages. Yet, something about it felt wrong. Still, we decided to climb up and check it out. The climb was steep and difficult, but the view from the top was worth it. From the treehouse, you could see the entire forest stretching out in every direction, the canopy of leaves swaying gently in the breeze. It felt like we were on top of the world. But the sense of calm didn't last long. As soon as we entered the treehouse, an eerie silence settled over us. It was as if the world outside had disappeared, and the only thing left was the oppressive stillness within the treehouse. "Hey, look at this," my friend Max called, holding up a faded old photo frame he'd found on the floor. The glass was cracked, but the image inside was still visible. It showed a family, 2 parents, and their young daughter standing in front of the treehouse, smiling in a way that seemed too perfect to be real. "Who do you think they were?" Max asked. Glancing around, I felt a chill creep down my spine as I stared at the photo. There was something unsettling about it. The family looked too happy, too perfect, almost staged. Then, out of nowhere, the wind picked up, howling through the branches. The treehouse creaked, as if it was alive, groaning under the force of the gusts. Suddenly, the air grew thick, almost suffocating. I couldn't breathe. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. I turned to Max, but his face had gone pale. He was staring at something behind me. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. Two dark eyes, staring at me from the corner of the treehouse. They were set deep into the shadows, too far for the light to reach, and yet, they glowed faintly, just enough for me to see them. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. "Max, do you see that?" I whispered. He didn't respond. His lips were parted, and his body trembled uncontrollably. The eyes blinked. I jumped back, but Max didn't move. His body was rigid, frozen in place. The wind howled again, and the treehouse shook violently. The eyes grew larger, more intense, as if whatever was watching us was growing closer. And then, a voice, soft and distant, came from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come." I turned to run, but before I could take a step, the ground beneath us shifted. The floorboards of the treehouse groaned and cracked, and I felt that something was pulling at me. The walls seemed to collapse inward, the air thick with a strange, heavy presence. I grabbed Max's arm, pulling him toward the ladder, but his body was as stiff as a board. His eyes were wide, and his mouth was moving, but no sound came out. We finally made it to the ground, but when I turned to look up at the treehouse, I saw something that will haunt me forever. The photo the one Max had found was now outside, floating just beneath the window, as if it had been thrown down to us. The treehouse was gone. There was no trace of it. The entire area was empty, as if it had never existed. I haven't gone back since, and I never will. It was supposed to be an adventure, a weekend camping trip with friends, complete with a treehouse we had discovered deep in the woods. We had all heard rumors about it, of course, stories about people who had ventured too close and disappeared, but they were just that, stories, right? We set up camp near the treehouse, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, we climbed up to the structure, eager to hang out away from the rest of the world. It was a perfect night, the stars clear above, the air cool and crisp. But there was something off about that treehouse. The way it loomed over us felt unnatural, as if the branches had grown in the shape of hands. Reaching down toward the earth, I ignored the feeling, chalking it up to nerves. We all did. As we gathered inside, I noticed something strange about the walls of the treehouse. There were scratches, long, deep gouges, that looked too fresh to be from the years of weathering it had endured. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the one to ruin the mood. We sat around chatting and laughing, but as the night wore on, an unease settled over me. There was something just beyond the treehouse, watching us. It started as a rustling sound from the trees, faint at first, but growing louder. A low growl began to echo through the night, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Everyone went quiet. I wasn't sure if they had heard it too, but the look on their faces told me they were thinking the same thing. We weren't alone. The growling stopped suddenly, and for a few moments, all we could hear was the wind rustling through the leaves. Then, I saw it in the darkness, just outside the treehouse. Two eyes glowed, faintly pale and unblinking, staring straight at me. I froze. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The eyes never moved, never blinked. They just stared. "Guys, do you see that?" I whispered again. Nobody answered, but I could feel their eyes on me, searching for whatever it was that I had seen. And then, the eyes vanished. But the fear didn't leave. We sat in silence for a while, too afraid to speak, until one of my friends, Lucas, stood up to investigate. "I'll go check it out," he said, but I could tell by the way his voice shook that he was just as scared as the rest of us. Lucas grabbed a flashlight and slowly descended the ladder, calling out into the night. We could barely make out his voice as he walked away from the treehouse, his flashlight casting an eerie glow across the forest. Minutes passed, and we began to wonder if Lucas had just decided to play a prank. But the longer we waited, the more uneasy I became. The darkness seemed to close in on the treehouse, and then I heard a screeching sound, followed by a loud thud. "Lucas!" I screamed, panic rising in my chest. But there was no response. I rushed to the ladder, desperate to find him, but when I stepped outside, I saw nothing. The forest was silent. I looked up at the treehouse, and that's when I saw Lucas, standing at the edge of the treehouse. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, but he wasn't moving. "Lucas!" I yelled again, but he didn't respond. I scrambled up the ladder, my heart racing, but as I reached the top, the last thing I saw was his body being pulled back into the shadows of the forest, his eyes still fixed on mine. I never saw him again. I had always loved our treehouse. It was the place where my cousins and I spent countless summers, playing games, telling stories, and feeling like we ruled the world. But after my cousins moved away, and I grew older, I stopped visiting. It sat there, in the same oak tree, unused and forgotten, until one summer, when I decided to go back. That was when things started to change. I walked to the treehouse on a hot afternoon, eager to relive the memories. The climb up the ladder was familiar, but as I stepped inside, I felt a strange unease wash over me. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the once cheerful room now seemed dark and oppressive. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just because it had been so long since I had been there. I opened the window to let in some fresh air, but as I did, I heard a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then the whisper came again, clearer this time, like someone was speaking just outside the window. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The whisper wasn't in any language I recognized, and it sent a cold shiver down my spine. I leaned out the window, trying to see if anyone was around, but the yard below was empty. I closed the window quickly, and the whispering stopped. But then I heard something else: footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, moving around the treehouse, coming from beneath the floorboards. I held my breath. Who could it be? I grabbed a flashlight and shined it around the room, trying to reassure myself. But that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The shadows seemed to move on their own. At first, it was subtle, like the shadows were stretching and pulling in different directions. But then, They began to twist and shift in ways that didn't make sense, as if they had a life of their own. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. The room felt like it was closing in on me. The whispers grew louder, now joined by scratching sounds, like fingernails scraping against the walls. The air became thick with a smell. I couldn't place a mix of damp earth and something rotting. I stumbled towards the door, desperate to leave, but as I turned the handle, the door wouldn't budge. I yanked on it again and again, panic rising in my chest. That's when I heard it, a low growl, vibrating the wooden walls. I turned around, and through the small cracks in the walls, I saw something that made my stomach churn. Eyes, hundreds of them blinking, moving just beyond the walls of the treehouse. I screamed and pounded on the door, the growling getting louder and more intense. But no one heard me. I was trapped. The shadows in the room seemed to crawl toward me, their eyes fixed on mine. It wasn't until I passed out from fear that the door finally opened. When I woke up, I was lying outside the treehouse, the sun setting behind me. I haven't been back since, and I never will. The whispers in the trees still haunt me at night. It was supposed to be just a summer project, fixing up the old treehouse my grandfather had built years ago. My family had moved back to the countryside after years of living in the city, and I thought it would be a great way to reconnect with my roots. The treehouse had always been a magical place to me when I was younger, but when I climbed up there for the first time in years, I felt something was wrong. The moment I stepped inside, a chill ran through me. The room looked just as it always had, barely any signs of decay. The walls still solid, but it felt colder, darker. The smell of dust and age lingered in the air, and there was a faint, damp scent that I couldn't quite place. As I explored, I found an old chest tucked in the far corner, covered in cobwebs. I hadn't remembered it being there before. Curious, I opened it. Inside, I found a stack of old newspapers, each one yellowed with age. But it wasn't the newspapers that made my skin crawl, it was the small, framed photo that lay on top. It was a picture of my grandfather, taken many years ago, standing proudly next to the treehouse. But the strangest part was the shadowy figure standing behind him. I squinted at the photo, trying to make out the face of the person or whatever it was. The figure was blurry, but I could make out the shape of an old man with a long, wispy beard. I was sure there had been no one else in that treehouse when the photo was taken. I shuddered and quickly put the photo back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. As I turned to leave the treehouse, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking across the wooden floor. I froze, my heart pounding. No one else was up there. I turned around, expecting to see some animal or another person, but there was nothing. The room was empty, but the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, getting closer, and I could feel them, as if something or someone was right behind me. Suddenly, I heard a whisper, cold and harsh, right next to my ear. "Leave this place." I spun around, but again, the treehouse was completely empty. The silence that followed was unbearable. I ran down the ladder, nearly falling in my haste, and didn't stop until I reached the safety of my house. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadowy figure in the photo, lurking behind my grandfather. The next day, I went back to the treehouse, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I entered, I found something new. The old chest was open, the photo missing, and on the wall, scratched deeply into the wood, were the words, "I never left." I had always loved spending time in the treehouse my dad built when I was a kid. It was a small wooden cabin nestled high in the branches of an ancient oak. For years, it had been my sanctuary, a place to hide, think, and dream. But something had changed since I last visited. I went back there one summer evening, hoping to relive the nostalgia of my childhood. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. The treehouse looked just as it always had, its weathered walls blending into the forest around it. I climbed up the ladder, the old wood creaking beneath my weight. The door was slightly ajar, an unusual sight considering I had locked it the last time I left. I stepped inside, the smell of dust and aged wood filling my nostrils. The air felt oddly heavy, thick with an unsettling presence. I glanced around, expecting to find nothing more than the usual piles of forgotten childhood memorabilia. But there was something different this time. Something was watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But as I sat on the old wooden bench near the window, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure, just a silhouette, was standing in the trees below. I couldn't make out any features, but the shape was unmistakable. It stood completely still, as if waiting for something. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just a deer or a trick of the light. But the longer I stared, the more real the figure seemed. It wasn't until I heard a low, guttural whisper from behind me that I realized something was terribly wrong. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, but the treehouse was empty. The door had slammed shut, and the room was now completely dark. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the door, but when I looked back out the window, the figure was closer, much closer than before. I bolted out of the treehouse, descending the ladder in a blind rush, my heart pounding in my chest. When I hit the ground, I dared a glance back up. The treehouse was now silent, but I could still feel the presence up there, waiting. As I ran, I heard the sound of footsteps above me, slow and deliberate. Someone or something was up there, and it was watching me. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. My friends and I rented a cabin in the woods, not far from where I used to live as a kid. We decided to spend the night in an old treehouse that I had built with my father when I was younger. It had been years since I had been back, and I was eager to relive those memories. When we arrived, the treehouse still looked the same, weathered and worn, but sturdy. We climbed up the familiar ladder, and the old door creaked as I pushed. It opened. The air was thick with the smell of pine and moss, but as soon as I stepped inside, I felt something was off. The room was colder than I remembered, and there was an unsettling stillness that seemed to hang in the air. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. We unpacked our bags and made ourselves comfortable, laughing and joking as we set up for the night. But as darkness fell, the mood shifted. The forest outside grew eerily quiet, and the wind whispered through the trees in strange, dissonant rhythms. It wasn't until later that night, when we were sitting around the small table playing cards, that we heard it. A creaking sound, like wood bending under pressure, echoed from above us. I looked up, my eyes scanning the ceiling for any sign of movement. I figured it was just the old treehouse settling, but the creaking continued, growing louder with each passing moment. Then, we heard something else. A scraping sound, like nails dragging across the wood, came from the very top of the treehouse. We all went silent, the card game forgotten. "Did you hear that?" My friend Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my heart racing. The air was growing heavier, and the temperature had dropped several degrees in the span of a few minutes. "Maybe it's just an animal," I suggested, trying to stay calm. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was up there, watching. Suddenly, the scraping sound stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood up and moved toward the door, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But before I could reach it, a loud bang came from above, followed by a low growl that made my blood run cold. My friends screamed in terror, and we bolted for the ladder, rushing to get out of the treehouse as fast as we could. But as I looked up one last time, I saw a shadow large and menacing move across the ceiling above us. We ran into the forest, not daring to look back, until we reached the safety of the cabin. We locked the doors and didn't speak a word about what happened. The silence of the night outside was deafening. The next morning, we went back to the treehouse to gather our things. But when we reached it, we noticed something strange. There were deep, claw-like marks on the outside of the tree, where nothing should have been able to reach. And the treehouse door was wide open, though we had definitely locked it the night before. We left right after that, but I swear the scratching sound still echoes in my mind every time I close my eyes.